What's up? What's up? This is James. I'm going to be doing the lineup review today for NFL DFS Week 10. It was a good week. I had a very good week in terms of ROI and in terms of cash games specifically. GPPs were not incredible. I had some lineups that were doing very well early, but fell apart obviously when the Seattle and Buffalo craziness started taking off. So overall, I think that this week made a lot of sense. There were plenty of ways to attack the slate. There were a lot of different running backs you could use, a lot of different wide receivers that you could use, a lot of different stacks that were really viable. And that's a week that I am always going to enjoy. I don't really like being pigeonholed into specific areas on a slate. I don't really like when I look at a slate and feel that I have to have a specific kind of build set. G Bear, yo, what's up, dude? Hope you're doing good. I'm excited to get that shipment of new cards. G Bear and I have been doing some business in me starting a Pokemon collection, so I've been buying some cards off of him, and he's got a cool collection. So hopefully, I can keep doing that, and he can keep abusing me for too much money for the cards. But yeah, this slate was pretty fun. We're gonna talk a little bit about the slate itself. We're gonna talk a little bit about my models. We're gonna talk a little bit about the way that people needed to leverage the slate, and yeah. So let's just kind of get started. So one of the first things that we should talk about is cash games. I swept my head-to-heads this week. It was the first time this year that I swept head-to-heads. I ended up I pushed my head-to-head win rate up to 75% in head-to-heads this year, which is great. I mean, I'm very happy with that. You basically hope for 60 to 63% if you want to end up with a positive ROI. So 75% feels really good. Obviously, we have a lot more season to go. We still have another 7 weeks left, but if I can maintain that 75%, then I can cover my very volatile GPP lineups. This is the lineup that I used in cash. Kyler Murray, Mike Davis, Aaron Jones, Stephon Diggs, Josh Reynolds, DeAndre Hopkins, Dallas Goedert, Duke Johnson, and the Saints defense. And that lineup is right here. Ended up scoring 151.9, mostly on the back of Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, and Stephon Diggs. Those were kind of like the big ticket winners, right? Those are the guys who ended up carrying my lineup forward. There were some very obvious ways to build in cash this week, and we had some conversations in Discord about some disagreements on it. The way that I build cash games is basically to say I want literally as much chalk as I can possibly have. I will go into the sheets on paydirt.ghost.io. I will sort by projected DK ownership or FD ownership. If you're playing on DraftKings or on FanDuel, just sort by ownership. And then I'm just going to be taking the guys that I think that show that they're going to be the highest owned. This week in cash, I think that you had to start with Mike Davis. Mike Davis, Aaron Jones. If I can spell anything correctly today. Mike Davis, Aaron Jones, Duke Johnson, Dallas Goedert. And then the one that I was getting a little bit of pushback on here was Stephon Diggs. I thought that this was kind of like, without even thinking forward, without even like making any more choices, this is where you probably should have started in cash. Mike Davis, Aaron Jones, and Duke Johnson, all very obvious plays. I think that you probably could have made some arguments for maybe Giovanni Bernard instead of Duke Johnson if you wanted to go that route. But for the price and for the ownership that you were going to be having on him, you go with Duke Johnson pretty easily. Mike Davis was obvious. I mean, he was like 60% owned in GPPs or something, as was Aaron Jones. Both of those guys ended up being extremely highly owned, and both of them were played together quite a bit. That makes sense, obviously. Mike Davis was vastly underpriced. He was minimum priced on DraftKings due to a pricing error, a pricing discrepancy that DraftKings had, where they actually tried to take down the slate and fix his price, but ended up not doing that. They only fixed his price on the Thursday through Monday. Pricing is generally static across slates. So when you are looking at the slate, generally a player is going to cost the same on the main slate as they do on the Thursday through Monday. Mike Davis was a pricing discrepancy straight up this week. Like there's no other way to put it. So he was absolutely a free square. Aaron Jones, he was also another free square in cash in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, because the Packers were still implied to score the most points on the slate, right? Like even after they had a massive team total drop down to 30.5, they were still implied to score the most points on the slate. And the reason for that big drop in team total is because of wind. So when we have wind that is 25 plus miles per hour with really high gusts, 45 to 50 miles per hour, that's going to put a detriment down on the passing game, specifically deep passes, but also intermediate passing. So obviously with the Packers having such a high team total, highest team total on the slate, and people seeing that the wind is going to be a big problem in that game, it made it so that Aaron Jones was just kind of like the no-duh play. He was cheaper than Devontae Adams. He is as involved as Devontae Adams is when they get down into the red zone. So Aaron Jones just made all the sense. Like he was free square. Dallas Goedert. So Dallas Goedert, the only reason why he was a free square, if we go over into the tight end range of outcomes, that there are two tight ends here that stick out, right? Like there's Darren Waller, who was expensive. He's the most expensive tight end on the slate. And then there's Dallas Goedert, who was going to be 18% out. I didn't think that Dallas Goedert was a good play, like by any means, in GPPs. He had a massive negative LevX. He was straight up a bad play in GPPs, and he turned out to be a pretty bad play. But he was he was going to be chalky. He was going to be really popular for whatever reason. My projections didn't like him. My baselines didn't like him, but that's not what I care about. What I care about is that other people like him. So the question was, and one of the questions that I had in the Discord in the pay dirt community was Dallas Goedert versus Darren Waller. And you really can't play the most expensive tight end in cash unless it's Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce, or sometimes George Kittle, if you want to go there, if the opportunity presents itself. Like a while ago, I played him in cash because I think they were up against Seattle. I think San Francisco was up against Seattle. It was the game they got hurt. But Darren Waller at 5,900, he gets plenty of opportunity. If you go onto the site, I have a free opportunity search tool. If you go to the NFL page, you can look up Darren Waller over the course of the year. And Darren Waller is very, very consistent. Overall, like he averages 8 targets per game. He averages 2.2 red zone targets per game. He averages 13.3 fantasy points per game. All of those are plenty nice, but you wouldn't pay 5,900 for almost any other position here at high ownership at like if they were only if they only averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game. With tight end, you almost always want to be playing the cheaper one. If you can find a cheaper tight end that is going to be very highly owned, you should take them in cash almost every single time. So Dallas Goedert was a really, really obvious play for me. And then the one that I got the most pushback on was Stephon Diggs. And Stephon Diggs, the reason why he was a free square for me was because he was in the highest total game of the slate by a long shot. Everybody was playing that Arizona Buffalo game. Like it was very, very easy to see that that's where people wanted to go. 2, he has had some of the best baseline work of any wide receiver in the NFL. He is, I think, the only wide receiver who has had double-digit fantasy points in every single game this year. So it was important to have those two things. When you look at Vegas totals, like the highest game by far, 56.5. The Rams in Seattle here at 54.5. We'll talk about them here in a second. But 56.5 for a team total, and the wide receiver one that has been getting consistent work. I know the stream is lagging a little bit. I don't really know how to fix it. Let's see. Experiencing minor issues. I think I might have to turn off my camera, maybe? I don't know. Here, let's turn off the camera for now. It isn't that bad? All right. Well, we'll just let it be choppy for now. So like, is the audio okay? As long as the audio is okay, then I'm not really super worried about it. But yeah, the super high total for Arizona and Buffalo just made sense. And then when you go over into the overall ranges, like Stephon Diggs is projected to be the third highest owned player on the slate. He's right there with Devontae Adams. He's right there with Alvin Kamara. Right there with Dallas Goedert. Had mute so I could sneeze. Yeah, he was projected to be the third highest owned player on the slate. So you have somebody who is projected to be very highly owned in the most popular game on the slate, with the highest total on the slate, with the best opportunity on the slate, and like, you just play that in cash. There were conversations about like playing Devontae Parker in cash, over Stephon Diggs. Like, some people want to play Cooper Kupp in cash over Diggs. Some people wanted to play like Terry McLaurin in cash over Diggs, and none of that makes sense to me. Like, that doesn't make sense to me at all. Terry McLaurin especially. Like, I would not have touched Terry McLaurin over Stephon Diggs with 10-foot pole. Nothing about my strategy tells me that I want to be taking Terry McLaurin. Like, Terry McLaurin wasn't even projected to be super popular. Yeah, he was projected to be 10% owned. Like, I would much rather block somebody else with Stephon Diggs than take a shot on Terry McLaurin. That doesn't, I just don't want to do that. So these were the free squares for me, I think, in cash. And then what I ended up doing is I would go and I would look at defensive ranks. The most popular defense was going to be the Saints defense by far. They were only 3K up against 49ers, so just kind of plug them in. Easy game. And then we have like these questions, and like, what I did first was I actually ended up going with Jared Goff, DeAndre Hopkins, and who's the last player? No, it wasn't DeAndre Hopkins. I think I had Cooper Kupp and 5,800 remaining. Who else did I have? Because I for sure had this initial combo. And then 5,800, I had Devontae Parker, maybe. Yeah, that was my dummy. That was my dummy, right? Was Devontae Parker here. And this was my dummy cash lineup at first. Like, this is covering all the bases that I wanted to have. But then what I ended up doing was saying, okay, well, I think Cooper Kupp sucks. Like, I don't actually think that Cooper Kupp is a very good chalk. I think that that's kind of like an exaggerated spot. If you go and you look at the opportunity search tool that I have on the site, you can put in Cooper Kupp, and you can see like this is an aberration. Like, he's not going to get 19 targets in a lot of games. And even when he did get those 19 targets, he only put up 22 fantasy points. Like, I don't really want this kind of a profile from somebody who I want to play in cash. So what I ended up doing was I ended up going to Josh Reynolds instead, dropping that down because I thought that Josh Reynolds was just as good of a play as Cooper Kupp. If you go and you look again, and I use the opportunity search tool a lot. I certainly recommend people use it. It is free. So if you put Cooper Kupp and Josh Reynolds next to each other, like, they really aren't that different, all things considered. Like, Josh Reynolds is somebody who gets better red zone work. He gets better fantasy points per touch. He has been kind of trending up in terms of his workload. Like, he's been a little bit more consistent over the last couple weeks. And Josh Reynolds at 3,500 against Seattle, I just thought that was a spot that people were going to be on. So I don't mind taking him if I think he's going to be really popular. That change let me go from Jared Goff up to Kyler Murray. And then I was still looking and I was like, all right, well, I can upgrade Devontae Parker, and that let me get up to DeAndre Hopkins. So that was my entire strategy in cash. Like, I zeroed this out. This lineup has $0 remaining. It hit everything that I want to do. It covers a shit ton of chalk. It has a cheap tight end. It has a correlation. It has a rushing quarterback. Like, this covered every single lineup checkbox that I want for cash games. And this swept head-to-heads this week. Put up 151. There wasn't a single person that beat me across I don't know, like 85 head-to-heads or something like that. Really, really good lineup. And chalk, like, as I have continued to go with this strategy of just building the most popular and chalky lineup that I possibly can, it's kind of really shown what the essence of cash games is. And if you take anything from this video, please take this. The essence of cash games is simply to let other people make mistakes. You're just playing the market. You're just looking for market values. You're looking for the lineup that everybody thinks is the best possible lineup for cash. And the best way to do that simply is just by playing as many players as other people think are good plays as possible. That way you cover as many bases as you can. Like this lineup, the only player that people maybe were not on was Josh Reynolds. And that's it. And people I think should have been on Josh Reynolds at 3,500 against Seattle. I'm surprised that he was not more popular than he was. So in cash games, build a lineup that lets other people make mistakes. Cash games, you should not be trying to predict the future at all. Like you should not be looking at anything other than what do people think are good cash game plays and just playing those cash game plays. Catch up on some questions here really quick. You went Allen, Lockett, Parker instead of Kyler, Reynolds, Hopkins. And Lockett, I think, was an okay play. But I absolutely do not think that he was a better play than Stephon Diggs. And Parker, I had him in my dummy lineup. I thought that he was going to be more popular than he was. And he ended up pretty popular. But I have been wary of Tua in that offense. I've been wary of the Dolphins. And I'm not necessarily sure that there will be somebody who is a very, very good play for cash games, at least. You went total fade of Jones and Davis. I did not go total fade of Jones. I did have Jones, but I had a total fade of Davis. Feel like you got a little lucky cashing this week, but you'll take it. Always take profit. You had Kyler, Kamara, Bernard, Hopkins, Brown, Samuel, Gronk, Dion, tight end, and Deontay Johnson and the Giants. In cash or in GPPs? 34 Midway Monster, what's up, dude? How you doing? Yep, stream lagging issues. I'm not actually sure why. It might be because I don't know why. Let's see. Chalk was bad. Wish I pivoted to 5K running backs like Gibson, who I had a feeling would go off. Patterson and Reynolds were good cheap hits though. You had Watson, Fuller, Hooper stack didn't change when got weather report not great. The pivots off of those really cheap running backs. We'll talk about those here in a second. But the pivots obviously played out really, really well. I did not want to fade much more than Mike Davis. I didn't really feel that I needed to. I thought that it was a position that so long as I was off of Mike Davis, who I knew was going to be 60% owned, I didn't really need to be that much different in other places. And we'll take a look at my GPP lineups here in a second. But I didn't feel that I needed to be that much different from just fading Mike Davis. James, am I going to go over my GPP lineup? Yes, I'm going to go over all three right now. DJ Moore at 5.1 was good price, least. You got that right, and Hunter Henry finally did something. Did Hunter Henry finally do something? I wasn't even paying attention to him. Put him in. Oh yeah, 13 fantasy points. Look at that. He hit his ceiling. God, that's so fucking depressing that Hunter Henry's ceiling is 13 fantasy points now. That's funny. All right. So, let's go ahead and talk about my lineups. Like I said, I was on a complete Mike Davis fade. My three lineups ended up being a Arizona stack, a Tampa Bay stack, and a Charger stack. The Arizona stack did the best, obviously, put up 150.3. Tampa Bay stack ended up doing not so great, only 122.24. And then the Los Angeles Chargers stack ended up being shitty, only putting up 85.08. But the ownerships were really nice. Underneath basically all the chalk that I played here, Well, I mean, Michael Thomas wasn't super chalk, but these guys were all really, really popular. But I knew they would be, which is why I needed to play this all together. So if you go and look at the range of outcomes, you can go into the backlogs and you can see the week 10 range of outcomes. Actually, I'm pretty sure that it's still up on the site. I had Arizona as the top stack overall. Not only did I have it as the top stack overall by projection, it was also the stack that I wrote about on Line Movement. Over at linemovement.com, I wrote about the Arizona stack being one of my favorite stacks of the week. I also talked a lot about it in the Recipe for Success video, how Arizona was just my favorite stack of the week, plain and simple. Typically, I do not love playing such a popular stack. Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, John Brown, like all three of those guys were really, really popular. But I knew that I was going to be different enough by not playing Mike Davis, and I knew that I was going to be different enough in this lineup specifically by also not playing Aaron Jones, because I wanted Alvin Kamara really, really badly in this lineup. This was actually the first lineup that I built, and we can kind of go over each individual play on it. But it's just worth noting that Arizona, I was in love with them this week. I thought they were in a fantastic spot. Tampa Bay, I actually played the Tampa Bay stack specifically, not because it projected super duper well. It projected modestly. But I played it as direct leverage off of Mike Davis. Whereas historically, well, at least this year, Mike Davis has not been good when the Panthers end up losing games. And at the same time, the best way to leverage a running back is by stacking the opposing team. Because if the opposing team ends up going off and just like smashing the team with a popular running back, the team with popular running back is going to have no choice but to pass in the second half. Like they're not going to have a lot of opportunity to run in the second half. So me stacking Tampa Bay meant that my full Mike Davis fade, like I would be getting some direct leverage on that as well, instead of just the indirect leverage of fading him and having other players. So I really, really like Tampa Bay stack. The Charger stack, again, projected modestly, but the reason why I wanted to go with the Charger stack is because when you go to the red zone splits and touchdown projections, the Chargers had one of the higher passing touchdown rates on the slate. They had one of the higher adjusted pass rates in the red zone, so they pass a lot when they get down in the red zone. I thought that they were going to be relatively low owned, and also we knew that Devontae Parker was likely to be a little bit of chalk. People were pretty excited about him, so I wanted to bring that back with him. It also just made sense because when I was building this lineup out, having Herbert, Keenan Allen, and Mike Williams, people never play Mike Williams, even though he's a really high upside guy. Bringing it back to Devontae Parker just made sense. I could have gone with Jakeem Grant, who was another person that people were kind of talking up this week, but I just didn't feel like doing that. I wanted to take advantage of the wide receiver that I think is the actual alpha wide receiver on that team, and that is Devontae Parker. So that's the how and why for the three lineups. Get caught up here for a sec before I go over each one. I needed to fade Davis or Jones. Yeah, I mean, let's see. I have no Mike Davis on any of these teams, but I did have, I think, yeah, so I had 2 Gio Bernard and 2 Duke Johnson. And then I had one lineup with Aaron Jones, and it was actually my worst lineup overall. But I really liked Duke Johnson. I really liked, what's his name? I literally just said his name. Oh, yeah, Giovanni Bernard. I did really like Giovanni Bernard and Duke Johnson. I thought that they were both really good plays for the price. And it allowed me to have cheaper running backs that would kind of like pseudo give me the same lineup as people who played Mike Davis and Aaron Jones together. So playing those two cheap running backs allowed me to have roster construction that was still competitive with the rest of the field without over-leveraging myself. But I mean, I did like Jones. I just wanted to fade Mike Davis. Look out for Andrews next week. Sadly, I think Boyle injury helps. I don't want to fucking be exposed to Baltimore again, man. I'm so tired of being exposed to Baltimore. I was exposed to Baltimore again on fucking Showdown, and they let me down again. I'm so tired of that fucking team. He's getting fed once it happened last game. Taysom Hill is a tight end on FanDuel, which is interesting. James Robinson also benefits from Thompson going to IR. Yeah, James Robinson is going to benefit a lot. He was getting the vast majority of the work when you go to the opportunity tool. James Robinson was getting the vast majority of the work, right? And then he still had 23 carries and 4 targets in week 10. But Chris Thompson, like you said, going to IR. I think that we're probably going to see more of these weeks where he has 20 plus rushing attempts and like a couple targets, and that's going to make him really, really valuable. I know that there were some sharper players that were tilting pretty hard that he didn't get the touchdowns he deserved. I think we all overvalued the loss of Preston Williams, who really didn't open up much more. Miami's just not that good of an offensive team. Leverage was there to swap from Jones to Kamara. Absolutely, and I'll talk about that here in a sec with this lineup. I want to try out single entry games. How do I narrow my pools to come up with the best line? You don't think about it like that. Because when you're building, and I'll kind of like talk through my process here on building out these lineups, but when you're building out lineups for single entry or for 3 entry max, the best thing that you can be doing is identifying a piece of leverage and building to take advantage of that. It's not necessarily saying like, oh, I need to play these players. Like, people make a big mistake when they're building, and specifically when they're hand building lineups, that they try to fit the best players they possibly can and like play, I don't know, all the players that project super duper well, which is thinking like an optimizer for sure. But you need to remember that optimizers are actually pretty stupid if you're not putting in the right constraints that allow you to build a high leverage lineup, especially in single entry stuff. Where a lot of people are putting their cash game lineups in, where a lot of people are putting in lineups that aren't actually built for GPP structures. Like, single entry is the best time to identify a piece chalk like Mike Davis or like Aaron Jones and build leverage lineups against them, like building Tampa Bay in single entry last week. That way you could have perfect leverage on Mike Davis and have plenty of upside to get up towards the top of the charts, like if Arizona and Buffalo fail, right? Like it's about taking advantage of what people think is going to work and rolling the dice on that. So it's not necessarily about narrowing down your pool. It's about finding 1 or 2 pieces of leverage and building a lineup that takes advantage of those, so that if those fail, you gain a lot more where the field loses. That's like the best way that I can explain it in short. However, if you'd really like to know how to build GPP lineups, then go to theoryofdfs.com and go buy the masterclass that myself and Blender HG put together. That'll tell you everything you need to know how to play GPPs. Hashtag ad. So we'll go over how I built my lineups here. The first one, like, we'll talk about Arizona because this one's the easiest one. This is the first lineup that I built this week. I started with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins with John Brown. I wanted to leverage Stephon Diggs a little bit, and I thought that John Brown was actually in a really nice spot. Like, when you go back and you look at the opportunity that he was getting moving up to last week, it kind of looked like he had finally turned the corner after getting healthy. Like, this 10 targets was really, really nice. Good yards per target. He has had good yards per target most of the year anyway. And it just kind of set up well going into a game with the highest total on the slate. So at 5,300, I really don't mind taking John Brown there. And then I plugged in Joe Bernard, Duke Johnson, and Alvin Kamara. Like, I knew that I wanted that combination of running backs in this lineup. I knew that I wanted to avoid Mike Davis and that I wanted to avoid Aaron Jones. Like, those 2 things were really important to me in this lineup, since I was going to be stacking a really popular game with Arizona and Buffalo. I knew that if I was going to make this work, I needed to have plenty of relative value from the other players in my lineups. So it was important to me to not have Mike Davis or Aaron Jones here. Plus, I thought that Alvin Kamara was a fantastic play regardless, and he was just a nice pivot off of Aaron Jones as a really expensive piece. Cole730, thanks for following, man. Appreciate that. And then I plugged in Danny Amendola and Logan Thomas. And this was mostly just like, I liked what I saw from Danny Amendola with no Kenny Golladay. If you go into the opportunity search tool and you put in Danny Amendola, Oh, spelled that wrong. The 10 targets in week 9 was fantastic. 15 fantasy points. Like he looked like he was benefiting very, very well from having no Kenny Galladay there. He looked like actually he was a better play than Marvin Hall. Marvin Hall obviously ended up doing very, very well, but I really liked Danny Amendola at 3,900, and I thought that he was a really good pivot off of Jakeem Grant, who people were pretty interested in. Logan Thomas was another person who benefited a bit from having a change of quarterback. Alex Smith ended up targeting Logan Thomas quite a bit more last week. A little bit less Terry McLaurin, a little bit more Logan Thomas, and a shit ton of J.D. McKissick, which I guess he's the new Alvin Kamara. But Logan Thomas and Danny Amendola as a secondary correlation stack, Detroit versus Washington, you'll see that everything here is basically outside of the running backs. Everything plays off of each other. Kyler Murray in a skinny stack with DeAndre Hopkins was my favorite stack of the week. Brought it back with John Brown. Had Danny Amendola against Logan Thomas. All three running backs are playing by themselves. Note that I did like Nick Chubb as well, and I actually go out of my way to avoid Nick Chubb versus Duke Johnson in other lineups because I did have Nick Chubb lineup. And I just went with Saints defense because it was easy to have. Like, it was not hard to have. So that was the Arizona lineup. This was the first lineup that I built. Loved it the instant that I put it together. So, Once the guy, what's up, dude? How you doing? Please help me fix my frames dropping on my stream, since you're like the stream guru. Seems other than that, lock week, paying down for QB with Jimmy G or Goff has not paid off, but I'll likely do it with Winston Thomas Cook. Paying down a quarterback is the right move, like most of the time. This last week, like I said, I wanted to play Goff, but when I ended up putting in Josh Reynolds and ended up moving up to Kyler Murray, that was just simply because Kyler Murray was the highest projected player on the slate, and I had the cash to do it. Like, it was not hard at all. So moving up there, like normally I would like to play the cheaper quarterback in cash, but this week it just allowed me to have the things that I wanted to have. McKissick getting 15 targets a game over the converted wide receiver at running back and Gibson. Yep. Yeah, it's just dumb as shit. Oh, cool. Thank you so much, Winston. I appreciate that, man. Yeah. Like if you're still in the Discord, just shoot me a DM. Because I need help with things. Let's see. You're gonna do some Burrow Boyd. I don't know if including Higgins. Yeah, I haven't looked at next week yet, but I do. I mean, I liked Cincinnati this week as well. And we'll talk about weather here in a second. But I need to run through all of these things. Oh, thanks, man. Thanks for the subscriptions, Cole and Once. I appreciate you guys. The Tampa Bay stack, like I said, this was just direct leverage off of Mike Davis. Since I knew that I was fading Mike Davis everywhere, I figured that I might as well have a Tampa Bay stack, since if Mike Davis fails, it's likely because Tampa Bay went off. Tampa Bay did indeed go off. They ended up putting up a shit ton of points. Tom Brady had a great game. 34.84 fantasy points. The problem was the rest of this lineup was not great. Gio Bernard, Nick Chubb, and Robert Woods was the combination of running back and flex. Gio Bernard and Nick Chubb. I specifically chose Gio Bernard here and knocked Duke Johnson, even though I liked Duke Johnson more, specifically because I did not want Nick Chubb versus Duke Johnson. Even in a game that was very low scoring, and we knew that it was going to be low, well, assumed that it was going to be low scoring because of all the wind, it just wasn't a situation where I wanted to have two running backs go up against each other. It just didn't make sense to me. So I'd rather have Gio Bernard there. Combination of Nick Chubb and Gio Bernard. I liked Nick Chubb a lot. I've already talked plenty about Gio Bernard and him being in a situation that I thought was very good, and people were not going to be high enough on him. He had averaged over 20 fantasy points in the 2 weeks that Joe Mixon was not playing. Joe Mixon was out again. Gio Bernard's price didn't rise up, and people just weren't going to play him because they were going to play Mike Davis, Duke Johnson, and Aaron Jones. So I thought there was a pretty big market discrepancy there for Gio Bernard. I went with Robert Woods against Tyler Lockett in a secondary stack. I wanted to leverage Cooper Kupp while also playing in a game that might be high scoring. I did take the under on that game for what it's worth. I thought that it was kind of a letdown game for Seattle, and it was. which is great. But I mean, in GPPs, you take the high upside from popular players. I actually figured that those two would be a higher owned combination, over 15% owned for both of them. They weren't, but I figured they were going to be higher owned. For the Tampa Bay stack, I went with Tom Brady, Antonio Brown, and Rob Gronkowski. Brady missed Antonio Brown for like a 50-something yard touchdown, and he missed Gronk again later on. He did end up getting the touchdown to Gronk, but there was a lot of upside left on the table there. Antonio Brown, actually, when you look at like what this team is doing with Antonio Brown, like Antonio Brown only played 48% of the snaps last week, but ended up with 23% of the air yards and 21% of the targets. Like, Brady is just going to fucking feed Antonio Brown. He just is. So that's going to be something that we really need to monitor and like pay attention to, because Antonio Brown, especially if his price doesn't rise up, he's going to be the best play on the Bucs for a while. And then I had Curtis Samuel here as the comeback against my Tampa Bay stack. I thought that Curtis Samuel was like the best play on the slate. They've been utilizing him a lot in the absence of Christian McCaffrey in terms of rushing plays in the red zone, passing plays in the red zone. They're getting a lot more involved. And then they were terrible. They just couldn't score for jack shit against Tampa Bay. And it is what it is, right? Like, you can't really control how bad they played. You can only put yourself in a position to take advantage of things if things go right. So this was this lineup. I really, really liked this lineup. This was pretty high up there in the power sweep for a while, but ended up falling back after, obviously this lineup started crushing. And then the third lineup was a Chargers lineup. I've already talked at length about Aaron Jones and Duke Johnson, so we already know about those two. I had a Jordan Reed and Michael Thomas secondary stack. I talked a lot about how much I wanted to have either Michael Thomas or Alvin Kamara in my lineups. This one ended up with Michael Thomas, who I thought was a really, really good play. Ended up being, pretty bad, obviously. But I did really like Michael Thomas. And Jordan Reed gets a lot of targets when he runs routes. The only question is how many snaps is he going to play? That is always the question that you kind of have to ask yourself with him, and he just didn't play near as much as I needed him to. He still had 5 receptions for 62 yards, which is pretty fucking good. If he catches a touchdown there, like 18 fantasy points for 3,500, I will take that. Michael Thomas actually was the lamer part of that secondary stack, which, you don't expect that, but it is what it is. Herbert with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. I knew that Keenan Allen was going to be super popular, so I made sure to have Mike Williams as well. And then Devontae Parker as a comeback. Like I said, I'm skeptical of Miami's offense with Tua. I don't think that he's really all that great. But having him as a comeback here, where if the Chargers are getting up by a lot of points and then Miami has to pass from behind, I thought that it would be Devontae Parker that would be getting the targets. And then I used the Giants defense against Philadelphia, who had 3 sacks, and that's all. They're pretty cheap. Just made sense. They rated well for my defenses. So that was the Chargers lineup. Would Evans over Lockett be too heavy of a stack? Or Jones over Bernard? Back in my my Tampa Bay stack? Yeah, I mean, I could have gone Mike Evans over Tyler Lockett, but then I would have had to change Gronkowski. Like, I'm not going to be going Tom Brady with Mike Evans and Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski. It's just too much. Even though Mike Evans ended up doing very well, obviously. I would never do that. I'm not going to stack 3 wide receivers with them. And then Jones instead of Bernard. Yeah, I probably, I don't know. Jones, like, I did say in the notes that Jones still had a role. Like, people were writing him off too quickly. He's their running back 1. Leonard Fournette is their running back 2. They just put Leonard Fournette in and play the hot hand if and when Ronald Jones fumbles the ball. So Ronald Jones, I really, really liked him this week. I just ended up not using him. How much is too much for a stack? I really cut it off at 2 receivers and a quarterback. there's very, very few instances where you can have three pass catchers with the quarterback and end up winning a GPP because raw points matter. Even if it's a really, really cheap stack, like raw points matter, and a quarterback would have to pass like 6 or 7 touchdowns or something like that in order to support three pass catchers with the team. And even if it's a running back that you're putting in there with other wide receivers, like it just gets really, really hard. The numbers just don't add up, and there's not enough points to be scored. There's not enough points to go around. So really quick, I did promise that I would talk about weather because it was a question that I had from the community. Weather is something that is like defensive matchups, like cornerbacks. It is something that you should pay attention to, but it should not drastically alter the way that you approach things unless it is very, very drastic. Weather, like we had with this last week, where we had multiple games that were experiencing 25 plus mile per hour wind, that had like snow, that had rain, that had gusts, like monsoon weather. That kind of stuff does matter. And like, you don't have to just take my word for it. You can look at the amount of points that teams lost just because of that weather. Like Houston and Cleveland saw their team total drop a whole 9 points. Green Bay and Jacksonville saw their total drop 8 points. Like there were plenty of teams that saw their totals drop by a lot. Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, I'm surprised, did not see a larger drop. It was only 2.75 points there, even though it was really, really bad weather. And when you have bad weather, it's like when you are building projections, yeah, you're going to dock things a little bit, right? Like you're not going to dock things into the floor because there's an 8-point drop, but you're going to drop things appropriately. You're going to drop things, 4 to 6 to 7%. You're going to hit the baselines pretty hard. Because a drop of 9 points on a game total is significant. I mean, that takes Green Bay from a total of 55.5, which is up there with the Arizona Buffalo game, all the way down to 47.5, which is like right next to Miami and the Chargers. I mean, that is a massive, massive drop. And sure, that is quote unquote only a drop of like 4 to 6 to 7%, but it matters for the ceilings as well. And one of the things about a ceiling game is that you have to have maximum efficiency the majority of the time. Things have to go really, really right for you to find your ceilings. And when there's that much weather, it makes it that much harder to find your ceiling. Specifically like Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. I was on Cincinnati. I was on a Pittsburgh stack. I really, really liked Deontay Johnson. I wrote him up multiple times. I talked about how good of a wide receiver he was. I even said that I thought that he was still a good receiver on this slate because his workload was so massive. But I ended up not using him and I ended up not stacking there because the weather was really, really bad. And there were other games that looked like they were going to be in a good spot to take advantage of regular conditions. So like in a vacuum, yeah, the median projections don't really drop all that much. They drop 4, 5, 6%. But the ceiling takes a significant drop off because there's less efficiency to go around all around. And a ceiling game, a standard deviation above a median outcome, takes everything going right for you. So when it makes it that much harder for everything to go right for you, when there's more variables to consider, it's harder for me to want to play that in GPPs. I don't have any FOMO because I didn't play Deontay Johnson in a Pittsburgh stack. Because I made the choice and I was sure of myself in the certainty of making that choice. I understood that their GPP ceiling was going to be lower and much harder to achieve because of the weather and because of the extra variables. There is something to say that once the ownership drops much farther than the ceiling has dropped, that it makes them a good leverage play in GPPs because people won't be on them. But that also insinuates that you are not fading other pieces of leverage that give you a larger leg up on the field. So like, yeah, the ownership was low on Deontay Johnson and lower than it should have been just because of the weather. But because I was already fading Mike Davis and Darren Jones, there wasn't really any need for me to gain any extra leverage by also taking Deontay Johnson. at that point, there's so many things that have to go right for me to have a good week that I'm just playing a parlay. So all of this kind of like comes together. When you look at weather, it's not something that you look at in a vacuum. You can't just say, oh, well, there's bad weather. People are not going to play this game. I should play this game. It matters what the other games are. It matters what the other chalk is. It matters what the entirety of the circumstances of the slate are, if you are going to be taking advantage of that chalk or taking advantage of that leverage. There's just a lot of things to put into it. Overall, when a game drops 8 points, like, I'm not going to stack that game anymore. There's a lot of people putting a lot of money on the under, and like that made sense because the game that dropped the most, that Houston-Cleveland game, ended up with 17 total points. Like Green Bay-Jacksonville ended up hitting the under, I'm pretty sure. What was the other game? The Pittsburgh-Cincinnati game? That one ended up doing well, but like I wouldn't bet on it to do well. And I think that people fall into a like this mode of FOMO, and there's this mode of like hindsight is 2020. Like I made the decisions that I made because I was sure of the choices that I was making. Those choices are not changed by one outcome. Now, if weather didn't matter at all for like an entire year, if I kept getting burned because I kept fading weather, and like I had a leak in that process, then yeah, I should care about that. But one game, like I don't care about that. The other two games were heavily affected by the weather. And that, it's something that you should pay attention to, but unless it happens consistently, don't actually put it into your process. So now, really quick, we are going to go over some subscriber lineups after I get some water. And then I'll have a little bit of time to answer some questions. And answer some questions that I got from the old Twit machine. With fleets now, I'm going to utilize those. Sorry, not sorry. So this is Wong34. This is a dedicated subscriber. He's been with me for a while. I appreciate the hell out of the guy. He ended up going with Kyler Murray with Christian Kirk and John Brown as his main stack. It is a skinny stack. It makes sense. It is similar to what I did with DeAndre Hopkins. He had Aaron Jones, Duke Johnson, and Gio Bernard. He also ended up with a secondary stack of Curtis Samuel, Rob Gronkowski. His defense, he correlated with Aaron Jones. He ended up using the Packers defense. This lineup's great, man. This is a very good lineup. This put together everything that I would usually want to do. You had a skinny stack with a rushing quarterback with Kyler Murray. You ended up bringing it back with John Brown. You had two of the high upside players with Christian Kirk and John Brown in the game. Love that. You utilized a lot of chalk around that with Aaron Jones and Duke Johnson. But you faded the largest chalk of the slate with Mike Davis and used Gio Bernard. And then you leveraged the heavy chalk of Mike Davis with Curtis Samuel and Rob Gronkowski. This lineup is awesome. It looks like something I would have built. The only thing that I will say is that I would have prioritized going with DeAndre Hopkins over Christian Kirk. I think that Christian Kirk is a good wide receiver, but I think that especially after last week where DeAndre Hopkins was not targeted much, there's usually a situation where an alpha wide receiver wants to get back to being the alpha wide receiver. And I think that you probably had enough money to end up going up to him, going up to DeAndre Hopkins if you drop down from Aaron Jones. And dropping down from Aaron Jones was not necessarily easy, but I think that you could have done it if you dropped down to Chubb. I'm not sure off the top of my head if that would have worked. But this lineup is really, really good. I don't really have any actual specific notes here because it looks like a lineup that I would have utilized. You utilized a tight end in a stack instead of just utilizing him in a one-off, which I really like a lot. Utilized Curtis Samuel, who I thought was one of the best plays on the slate. Like, yeah, this lineup is awesome, dude. The variant sucks. Like, Curtis Samuel ended up not getting the work. It was DJ Moore week. And then John Brown got injured. Aaron Jones, Duke Johnson, and Gio Bernard all underperformed. But I think that all of these pieces made sense. And this is a very competitive lineup in any contest you enter it into. This is the Kid J. Taylor. No cookies in the Discord. He ended up going with a killer stack. 191.7 is a fucking awesome score. Was Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins with Stephon Diggs ended up going with Josh Jacobs, Mike Davis, and Deontay Johnson at running back and the flex. Deontay Johnson and Eric Ebron together without Ben Roethlisberger, though, is not awesome. You also had Josh Reynolds as a individual punt play. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Kyler Murray with DeAndre Hopkins, Stephon Diggs. Thumbs up. Hella thumbs up. Great lineup. And then going with Josh Jacobs as a very low-owned pivot off of Aaron Jones made a lot of sense. Like I talked about that in the recipe for success, and I'm pretty sure I talked about it in the team notes. Because of Josh Jacobs specifically, and because of Deontay Johnson, having those two low-owned plays, it did allow you to take Mike Davis as well. Remember that when you have a player that is 5% owned, it doesn't matter if you also have a player that is 60% owned. Because the most people that can have your lineup now are 5% of the field. So Josh Jacobs at 4% owned, that means that only 4% of the rest of the lineups in this tournament can have something that is like this. And only 4% of the people are getting the points that Josh Jacobs brings. And Josh Jacobs is fucking awesome. So pairing him, especially with Deontay Johnson, who is also only 4% owned, like you're very unique. You have a lineup that is getting a lot of relative points from two players that are very low owned and very high upside. So having those two players makes a lot of sense. And yes, absolutely, Jacobs with Raiders D was a very nice pairing. Those things make sense. Like Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, Stephon Diggs with Josh Jacobs, the Raiders defense, those things make sense. The problem, and you already identified it in the Discord, is that Eric Ebron and Deontay Johnson do not belong together. And that, that causes problems. Like if you were going to go with this, then you would have to assume that Eric Ebron and Deontay Johnson would both have very strong games. Especially since you only skinny stacked with Kyler Murray. You were assuming that Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins were going to be a higher scoring combination than if Eric Ebron and Deontay Johnson ended up putting up 20 plus fantasy points each with Ben Roethlisberger at quarterback. With two wide receivers and with Ben Roethlisberger at quarterback, that's 4 touchdowns. Ben Roethlisberger probably ends up doing very, very well in this slate. So having both of them doesn't make any sense. What you could have done is use Will Dissly instead of Eric Ebron and have that against Josh Reynolds, where that gives you the correlation of a tight end against the wide receiver. It gives you a nice secondary stack. They're both cheap and they're both high upside GPP plays. It's not that I necessarily liked Will Dissly. It's just that I think that you could have gone that route and ended up with a lineup that made more sense for GPPs and for high upside GPPs. Outside of that, this lineup is really, really good. Not fading Mike Davis, but getting low enough owned players outside of Mike Davis to make it worth it. Awesome. The only problem is Eric Ebron. Not even Deontay Johnson, but specifically Eric Ebron. You also could have gone with Deontay Johnson against, Tyler Eifert, I think, is the dude for Cincinnati right now. Or, I don't know, whoever the fuck the tight end is for Cincinnati. You could have gone with that route as well. But the tight end going with Deontay Johnson, you're just hoping for... this is just a player parlay. There's no correlation. This is making your lineup so that more things have to happen for you to end up having a good slate, for you to end up having a high ceiling, high GPP day. But otherwise, this lineup is awesome. So this is PackFan. This is Samson in the Discord, I believe. He went with Kyler Murray naked. Already, I have talked to you about going with quarterback with your wide receivers. He also ended up going with Antonio Gibson and Leonard Fournette, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, Curtis Samuel, Robert Tonyan. I do not know how to pronounce the running back for Miami and the Browns defense. So the main problem with this is, and it's very, very easy, this is just a player parlay. There are no correlations here at all. You're basically just trying to pick players from the pool and just put them together and hope they all do well. The reason why that's not good for GPPs is because make it so that too many things have to happen that are right for you to have a good week. The reason why you correlate your quarterback with your wide receiver, the reason why you play your quarterback with your wide receiver is because it makes it so that when your quarterback does well, there's a good chance of your wide receiver doing well. So that is one less thing that has to happen. Like the more things that you have connected in your lineup, the less things you actually need to be right about in order to have a high scoring lineup. It's not about picking players. Like this is just all picking players that you hope are going to do well, which is as close to trying to predict the future as you can get. And you know that I'm not big on predicting the future. I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm just trying to make lineups that make sense. And there are just far too many things that need to happen for this to go right. Like instead of going with Keenan Allen, you could have jumped up to DeAndre Hopkins and like had a lineup that made a bit more sense. Instead of going with that, there's just like it's hard for me to look for ways to like make this make a lot more sense. That the easiest way to make this lineup make a bit more sense is going up from Keenan Allen up to DeAndre Hopkins and down from the Browns to like the Tampa Bay defense, I think would have made sense. But yeah, just you don't want to build a player parlay. Like if you want to build a player parlay, go put this in on like Bovada or the DraftKings Sportsbook and just like put in an entire parlay of all of these players scoring touchdowns. Like you'll get just as good of odds for entering a lineup in GPPs. Like don't do this. You got to have correlation. And then this is Nick Slane BP. He is one of my favorite people. He's been with me for a long time. He ended up putting up 162.5. Kyler Murray with DeAndre Hopkins and John Brown. Awesome. I use same combination. Ended up going with Keelan Cole and Robert Tonyan. Really like that as a secondary stack. I talked a lot about Robert Tonyan. I wrote him up over on Line Movement as a value play to utilize. Keelan Cole made a lot of sense with no Laviska Shenault Jr. Keelan Cole is definitely the guy that gets the work when there is a wide receiver out for the Jaguars. And utilize secondary stack there means that you didn't need to rely on Aaron Rodgers or Jake Luton to win you a GPP. So the weather there is not as big of a problem. For running backs, he ended up going with Aaron Jones and Mike Davis with Alvin Kamara. So the one problem here is going with Robert Tonyan and Aaron Jones in the same lineup. And the main reason for that is that when you use Aaron Jones and Robert Tonyan, you're eating into a lot of the upside that these players can have. Like Robert Tonyan is only going to be viable if he catches 2 touchdowns. Like in GPPs, he's only really going to be valuable if he catches 2 touchdowns. And those touchdowns are only going to come in the red zone. Like he's not a deep threat guy. So if those touchdowns are the only way to make him relevant and they come in the red zone, then that's going to eat into the upside of Aaron Jones. And Aaron Jones is much more expensive. So instead of Robert Tonyan, you could have gone with you could have gone with Jordan Reed. Like Jordan Reed against Alvin Kamara. And that would have made sense. And then you still would have had Keelan Cole against Aaron Jones. And you would have had Alvin Kamara against Jordan Reed, and that would have been plenty of correlation. I would have still put together a lineup that was taking advantage of less situations, so you would need less things to go right. And it would have avoided the negative correlation between Aaron Jones and Robert Tonyan. But overall, I like this lineup a lot. I can tell you built it from the sheets. I can tell you built it from reading through my content as well. So this is a really good lineup. Toph, you end up posting the lineup in the Discord. Hopefully I'll be able to review it. Let's go take a look. Let's go try to find it. There it is. And this will be the last thing that I review. And then we'll answer a couple questions. All right. So, you went with 168, pretty damn good score. Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins. Did you bring it back with anybody? Looks like not. Okay. Ended up with Wayne Gallman and Mike Davis as running backs. Wayne Gallman, very low owned, only 3.2% owned, and a pretty good pivot off of Duke Johnson. So I can understand you going with that route. You had Devontae Adams along with Juju Smith-Schuster, Dallas Goedert, and Josh Reynolds. And And the problem there is that you had a lot of guys that were just kind of like individual plays. Juju Smith-Schuster ended up like they all ended up doing well. Like Josh Reynolds and Juju Smith-Schuster and Devontae Adams, they all ended up getting there. But instead of going with Devontae Adams or instead of going with Juju Smith-Schuster, you could have gone with Stephon Diggs. If you drop down from Devontae Adams to Stephon Diggs, you could have gone up either at Juju Smith-Schuster or Dallas Goedert or Josh Reynolds. You could have come up from Mike Davis to like Nick Chubb, probably, and ended up with quite a bit more upside. So I like the skinny stack here with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, but you should have brought it back with Stephon Diggs. That's really the main note here. And Dallas Goedert, I thought was a bad play in GPPs, just straight up. The very negative Lev X on a tight end is going to tell you probably not to play that tight end. Especially because tight end has been so bad this year that if you can get away from utilizing the same one that a lot of the field is utilizing, you probably should. Unless it's Travis Kelce. Dude's fucking baller, and he's just going to crush. So overall, I like the pieces in this lineup. I would have gone with Deontay Johnson instead of Juju Smith-Schuster, but overall, I like this. Just drop Devontae Adams down to Stephon Diggs, upgrade Mike Davis to Nick Chubb, and you're off to the races. This lineup ends up putting up like, I don't know, like 196 off the top of my head, something like that, and you end up crushing. But overall, I like the pieces that you used. I just didn't love the way that it was put together. So let us now get caught up a little bit, and then I'll answer a question or two. Do you always have a bring back on stacks, or sometimes you go low and bring back to counter a stack like only Reynolds versus Seattle? I will almost always try to have a bring back. I try to build as much correlation in my lineups as possible because I know that it's the best way for me to build a lineup that is going to have upside in GBPs. Going with one-offs is fine if they're really, really cheap, like Josh Reynolds was, but it has to be a really, really convincing argument for me to go with a cheap play like that. Let's see. Kamara Saints D was really nice too. Sanders Philadelphia did not work out for me. Yeah, but Sanders got a lot of the work. I didn't really like him that much, but he got a lot of the work. So now, let's see. I think the only questions that I have left to answer are going to be on Twitter. All right, so how do you know if the chalk is the right chalk? How do you know when to fade? Do you max it at 100%? Knowing when the chalk is right is really, really hard. Most of the time, I don't really care so much about if chalk is good or not. I care more about how much I can gain if the chalk doesn't work out. So like this week with Mike Davis, there was a lot to gain if he ended up failing. At 4K and at 60% owned, like if he doesn't end up going off, and you have a good pivot to him, like maybe the running back from Miami, that Ahmed guy, if you have him instead of Mike Davis and you build the exact same lineup that everybody else did, but without Mike Davis, you end up passing 60% of the field simply because you had significantly more points from your pivot. But then there's other players like, I don't know, like Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara when he was like 35% owned or something, or Derrick Henry when he's really, really highly owned, or Dalvin Cook. Those are better questions about whether you should fade it or not, because their floor, like their quote unquote failure, is usually still somewhere around 18 to 20 fantasy points. So unless you think that a player is going to absolutely tank, there's less to be gained, because really what you're trying to do when you fade chalk is you're trying to find an applicable play that is within the same position that you can utilize to gain more points than what the field gained from the chalky play. Because that gives you a lot more relative value in your lineup, so you can pass more and more people, so you actually have a chance of winning a GPP. So when you're thinking about playing chalk, the question isn't, is this chalk good or bad? There's no such thing as good or bad chalk. It's just chalk, like it's just popular plays. The question is, what players give you the best chance to pass significant portions of the field, and what can I gain from fading each piece of different chalk? If you identify like I did that Mike Davis was just the chalk that you should fade this week because you had the most to gain, like I'm still going to probably play Aaron Jones. I still want a little bit of Duke Johnson. Like that those guys I think were in better spots than Mike Davis was. At slightly lower ownership, and I thought that just fading Mike Davis was going to give me plenty of leg up on the field if the other guys ended up doing right. So it's not so much about predicting what chalk will be good or bad. It's more just thinking to yourself, what can I gain by avoiding this piece of chalk? And I think that that is a great note to end on. Again, thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. I know this stream was choppy, and I'm sorry about that. I'm going to have some people help me with my stream. But thank you for tuning in. Thank you for asking questions, giving me things to talk about. If you are not a subscriber over at paydirt.ghost.io, go subscribe. Putting together a lot of cool improvements to the site right now. Doing everything that I can to get ready for NBA season, which is starting up soon, and it's every sport for just one low monthly price. So go subscribe over there. Thank you to those who subscribed here. I also appreciate that. I'm going to get out of here to go eat some dinner, but please hit me up on Twitter if you guys have more questions about things. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a good day.